Okay, let's start with today's lesson. Endgame studies based on fortresses. So what I'm going to do today is first I'm going to go through a lot of fortress positions in endgames. And there's a lot of mini positions. You might know many of them, but we will skip through a lot of those mini positions just to get an overview. And my definition of a fortress is broad. So it's basically you have more material than the opponent, but you are not able to win. So in fortress position, it's usually stalemate that I use to make the draw. So stalemate tricks are very normal, but it's also that it's not only stalemates, at least not in my broad definition here. So there's a lot of positions with exchange up. So when is rook versus knight winning? When is rook versus bishop? Could also be with a pawn to each side. So positions like these, because knowing about these positions have an influence of how the direction of the study. Then there's a lot of studies with the rook's pawn and how there's a lot of stalemate tricks with rook's pawns and how some positions with knight and pawn and bishop and pawn cannot win. Then we have a case. So these are the main cases. Then we will treat a few positions with queen versus bishop and knight, and also a positional draw where you're up a queen, but you cannot do anything. So there's a few smaller themes at the end, but our two main themes will be exchange up and something with a rook's pawn. Okay, so let's get to it. I will unshare for a moment and then get to the fortress positions. And here you are welcome to put in the chat if you think it's a fortress or not. Sometimes it matters who moves first, and sometimes it doesn't. I would suggest that a strict definition of a fortress is where it's not tempo sensitive, like this position. So in other positions, we'll see later, like queen versus pawn on the second rank, then of course it has to be the queen side to move, otherwise the pawn would just promote. So, but I still consider those queen versus pawn positions as fortresses simply because you are up so much more material, but you cannot win. So that's my broad definition. But I suspect a more narrow definition would be it doesn't matter who's to move. So for this one, we're going to go through a lot of fortress positions, just to recap shortly. And you can put in the chat if you think this is winning for white or if black is able to make a draw. And once we're done with this one, we will quickly move on to more position. Yeah, that is correct, Matt. So this is a win for white, no matter who's to move. So promoting, yeah, hi Omar. So you're right, this is winning for white, no matter to move, no matter who moves first. A knight in the corner is always usually bad for black. White to moves first can simply make a waiting move. Black will lose the knight or get mated. And if black moves first, black has a problem. So this is winning for white. So let's take the next one. So this typical thing in endgames. So then what happens if we move it one row or one file? And then let's compare those positions. So what about this one? Is white winning or can black draw this? So rook a7 is not winning because I can play king d8. And then I can alternate between these two squares with the king. So it actually, this is a draw. So it actually doesn't take a lot for rook versus knight to be a draw. The only thing we need to do is get the knight outside the corner. So the reason why this is a draw, we can talk about this briefly, is black has too many options. So one is to move the king back and forth here. Another one is to move the knight back and forth here. Okay, then we could try to play rook b6, which prevent the king from moving back and forth and the knight from moving back and forth. But then black has a third option. Then we can move the knight back and forth here. So this is too many options for black, for white to put black into control. So there's no way to do that. So this is a draw. So the knight only needs to get out of the corner, then white is not winning it, which is quite useful to know. So let's take the next one. What about this one? Win for white or draw? Draw? Yeah. So if you have a knight and a rook's pawn, don't get the pawn all the way to the 7th rank. So you have to free the knight if you want to try to control the promotion square, but every time you get closer, then you're stalemating the black king. And otherwise, the king can just go back and forth. Yeah, it shuffles between king h8 and king g7. So this is a draw. What about the next one? Yeah, this is a win. No way to get a stalemate here. This is not stalemate, there's extra space. And now we simply need to control the promotion square. So getting the knight to f7 is the winning idea. And then white simply promotes the pawn. Yeah, so as long as the pawn, the rook's pawn is not on the 7th rank, then knight and pawn is winning. What about this one? Yeah, the win, the bishop has the corner square. So we can see already here, the black king is being pushed out. King controls, the bishop controls the corner square. So we're simply going to push our pawns down. Yep, same color bishop for promotion, that's right. So what about this one? So this is the opposite. So this is a draw for black because the bishop has the opposite color. And so all these positions, they kind of fall into the category of, let's see, restricted definition of fortress, because it doesn't matter who moves first. And it's going to be a draw anyway. And black also used stalemate tricks. So something like this. And then every time white tries to get closer, we'll stalemate the black king. But as I said at the beginning, I will use a broader definition. There will be some position coming up where we use the broader definition of a fortress. So what about this one? So as a lot of study composers like to use this one. Yeah, Matt, you are correct. So we saw this idea. This is a draw, it's correct. We saw this idea in the study by Trotsky, where two same-colored bishops. So there's no way to get to the h7 pawn without stalemating the black king. Don't play king h8 here because of checkmate. But otherwise, keep the white king out. And then if the white king tries to approach, stalemate, or it doesn't really matter. We can move the bishop first. And every time we try to get closer, it's stalemate. So this is a draw. So what really makes the difference here is that pawn being pushed to h6. Because if black was able to play king h6, then we would get to the h7 pawn. We could just make a waiting move for this long diagonal. So it's really because the pawn has been pushed to h6 that it's a fortress. What about if I change the color of the bishop? Yeah, Uma, that's correct. It's a draw. There's no way to get to h7. We cannot sacrifice the bishop. It's the same. Cannot get to h7. Every time we try, stalemate tricks. So a draw again. So let's try the next one. What about this one? Yeah, it's a draw. So this one, I haven't seen in any books. I just thought it's this nice idea of endgames that you try to compare. What if you move a file out? So I just comparing positions. So this is a draw. Stalemate tricks again. Yeah, bishop f6, king g8. So this idea is very interesting because this could be a pawn on f6. It could actually be if white had a pawn here on f6, then king g8 would still be a fortress. Because now we're ready to take, and if f7, king f8, then we have a fortress with 2 pawns versus 1. It just came to my mind, but it's the same idea. We just wait one move before we take so we don't end up in white having the opposition. Anyway, otherwise, I'm not sure. Did Sam Shankland resign a similar fortress position against Jiri recently, which was a draw? I'm not sure about that. Maybe the rest of you can try to answer that. I'm not familiar with a game like that. But here the problem is the same. We cannot sacrifice the bishop because the white pawn is in front of our king. And if we try to get closer to that pawn, stalemate tricks again. So it doesn't work. Okay, let's take the next one. Now, same position, I change the color of the bishop. What do you think? Yeah, Oma, you are correct. Yeah. It is a draw. So we can, black has 2 options actually. Yeah. We can either go to the corner if we want. We can also stay on f8. Still stalemate tricks. So even if king e6, we can go to the corner now. We can also just stay here. It doesn't matter. Because this is still stalemate. And if we run to the corner, same problem for white. Cannot get closer to that pawn because of stalemate. So there's a lot of these bishop and pawn versus pawn. So now we come to queen versus black pawn. So here it's not stalemate in the traditional sense that it doesn't matter who moves first, because this is always white to move first, otherwise black just promotes. But these are relevant for let's say queen versus pawn is a huge material advantage. So I'm going to present you with 4 positions where the pawn is here, 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 and here. So which one of these 4 positions are drawn and which one are wins? Yep, that is correct, Matthew. Okay. So this is, yeah, f pawn is a draw, and the rook's pawn is also a draw. Let's see why. So white can always get to this position with a check on this square, attacking the pawn, forcing the black in front of the pawn or away. If it goes away, we take the pawn. But here white doesn't have time to bring the king in because of stalemate tricks. Okay, so that's why it's a draw. There's no time to bring the king in. Then we have a g-pawn. That is a win simply because there are no stalemate tricks. No stalemate tricks here, we simply take the pawn. If king goes here, we get closer. And now we just start all over. This is the most precise. And then we can get no stalemate tricks for black. This is winning for white. With an f pawn, it is a draw because we can hide in the corner with stalemate tricks. So let's say we do the same again with white, getting closer to the pawn. And now we have one move with the king. And that is all we are going to do with that king. Because in this position, we're not going in front of the pawn, we're going in the corner. White has no time to bring the king in. If it takes here, it's stalemate. So a rook's pawn and a bishop's pawn is a draw. So a central pawn is a simple win for white, the same way as a knight's pawn. There is no stalemate tricks for black. So here we force the king in front of the pawn and then we get closer. So this is winning for white. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now we come to rook versus bishop. What about this one? A win for white or a draw? So this has something to do with the bishop's color compared to the corner. So there's a wrong corner and a right corner. Yeah, this is a draw. And I'm glad you mentioned this trick, which is check. So here's the point. The point is that check. So this is a good king corner for the black king because it's opposite the bishop. White does not have waiting moves here because it's stalemate. Yeah. So what white can do is on the way, we can give a check, and now there's no bishop b8, and then we can attack the bishop. The problem is there is always going to be a check on this long diagonal. And then white king has to move, and there's no way for white to win this. So let's say if white made a waiting move, if black by accident played bishop d6, then white would be winning. So black has to make sure that we have checks on this long diagonal. Now it's winning with this trick because we have this typical double threat going to the back rank and attacking the bishop. Black doesn't have a check here on the diagonal, so now it's losing. But otherwise, rook f7, we can just, we can play here, we can play bishop h2. Doesn't matter too much. So this is a draw because the king is in the right corner, which is opposite to the bishop. So this is the wrong corner, the same color as the bishop. So this is very important for many rook versus bishop positions when you start to add pawns on the same side. So sometimes you can get it down to this position if the pawns go away, and then it's very important if the king is in the right or the wrong corner. So for instance, apart from the fact that white is winning here with a waiting move and mate next move, then in general, this position where the king is trapped in the wrong corner and cannot run out, this is winning no matter where the black bishop is. The black bishop can try to hide down here, but white can chase it out and then do this double attack to the bishop and mate on the back rank. We saw that in the class Interesting Endgames class 2. But this is, if we can trap the king in the bad corner, it's always winning. It doesn't matter where the black bishop is. But of course, in this position, we had the direct mate in 3 like this. So this one is winning. So let's move on. What about this one? So I'm going to move it to the left. So you will see the pawn here. Then I will move it like this. And I will also move black along. And then this, and then this. And then we have 4 different positions to compare. These are very useful. So this one is a win because white can sacrifice the pawn at the right moment. No, that doesn't work because the king is in the right corner. So because we're in the right corner, you cannot, this is a stalemate. So because we're in the right corner, that's why it's not winning for white. But the idea of sacrificing the pawn is very important and is the way to win when we have a win. But this one is a draw because the king is in the right corner compared to the bishop. So we can simply take the pawn and go to g8. And the bishop just stays on this long diagonal. So, sorry about that, just a moment. Yeah, so the king can never get to the g6 square. There's no way we can get that bishop off that diagonal. So this is a draw, it's a fortress. So what about the next one? Yeah, now the idea from before works. So this is a win. So I cannot get my king closer because that bishop diagonal is too long. But I can sacrifice the pawn. So if bishop takes, then king g6. And here there are no stalemate tricks, so I can simply win the bishop and checkmate. And if king h7 here, we have to be a little bit precise with white here. So instead of just sacrificing the pawn, now we would like to trap that king in the corner, but now the king runs out. And there it's a draw because the king was able to run out. So we have to be a little precise. We just played rook f7 first, and now we're ready to sacrifice the pawn to get to the g6 square. And taking that pawn doesn't help. We can make a waiting move, and we will get to the g6 square. And then the king is trapped in the corner, and we are winning. So let me just show you quickly why it's winning. So let's say the black bishop is trying to hide behind the king. Then we will chase it out into the open, like this. bishop h4, we have a discovered check that wins the bishop. And as soon as the bishop goes out here, let's say, then we attack it and try to get to the back rank. And here we can go this way. So something like this, and then we have a waiting move. So the black bishop cannot hide behind the white king. We can always force it out. So do you know about this one? Otherwise, you can make a qualified guess. F7. Yeah, if I took that pawn now, white would be winning with king f6. Because the king is close to the corner, but we're not yet there. So white can still do the... What if we play king g7 here? And it's not so easy to get the king closer. So this is again a draw because the king is close to the right corner. So white can of course do similar tricks with, I don't know, we could try to do this. It doesn't really matter. Because now I can just run to the right corner. And this is a draw. So in these positions, you always have to be careful of tricks like this, the intermediate check. Now I cannot go to f8 because of this double attack. But this is where I can search for safety in that right corner. So even though if you try something like this, I can just play bishop here. I'm in the right corner, everything is fine. This is a draw. So in those positions, we had a draw and a draw, and now a win in those two. This position is winning. But let me tell you, this is not easy to win for white. So let's say that with the pawn here, it's quite an easy win because we can play king e6. And once you make this little step with the pawn, it suddenly becomes extremely hard to win it. So the way to win it is to move the rook, trying to control the bishop on a completely open board. And because the pawn is a center pawn, then those diagonal leading up to, let's say, this square, they are not so long. They are shortened. So white can, in fact, use the king and rook and try to dominate that bishop on an open board. And then there's a lot of in-between checks and waiting moves and domination moves. This is a very hard endgame. So this is one of those endgames. There's a few of them where rook and pawn versus bishop is extremely hard. It's very difficult to understand even if you try to study it. But it's fascinating how the rook and the king can dominate that black bishop on an open board and eventually win. Okay, then we have positions with knight versus pawn. So let's do that quickly. So this is a win for black because white is not able to make a ring. So the knight got trapped in the corner. If you have to stop the pawn, a rook's pawn, you have to stop it there so you can form a ring in position. So this is not exactly a fortress in the traditional sense because the knight has a higher value than the pawn. But a pawn close to promotion is a little bit of an exception because it raises in value. And all other pawns than rook's pawns usually can be stopped. So we can easily find, let's say, a ring to keep this pawn from promotion and our knight from being trapped. So that was a lot of fortress positions. The good news is, I think there's only 15 or 20 that's really useful to know. So that's just what we did. We went through a lot of them. So here is a study, a nice one, based on some of the ideas of rook versus bishop. And the final point of the study sees the king and rook actually dominate the bishop on an open board, which is nice because it also happens in the endgame theory. But there is another more simpler way to the win, which I will show you. Okay, so the problem is here that white's rook is attacked. And if black is able to get this pawn out of the way, opponent c6, then it's a draw, because just being an exchange up is usually not a win. There has to be special circumstances. So we give a check. And now it's not so easy for white to keep this pawn on c6 defended. If rook takes b6, we have knight d5. So white has to find something clever here. So bishop e8 is the clever move, because we are attacking the knight now. So if bishop takes c6, we have rook takes e7. So black is forced to play knight takes c6. And now we can play rook takes b6. So this looks like white is winning. There's a pin on that bishop, it's undefended. We also have threats like rook a6 check. The knight is under attack. So this looks like, and if king a7, we can just bring the rook back. So, but there's one move that keeps black alive. What's that? King a7. Then I think I can just move back with my rook. Oh, wait a minute. King a7. That's a good question. So this pin is still there. Yeah, I think it's a problem here. Let's see. What then? You're unable to move. And if you play king a6, I think I can play rook a1 and then take on c6 next. Let's say king a5, I have bishop takes c6. King b5, I also have bishop takes c6. So black is simply too clumsy there. So it doesn't work. Okay, so king a7 doesn't work. Let's see. Knight b4 is the crazy move. Yeah, and everything is just hanging. The idea is there's a knight fork on d5. So, and just knight e7 doesn't work. Same idea, because we have this check on a6. So knight b4 also defends this check on a6. So bishop is hanging on e8, everything is hanging. So, but white has this clever move here. Bishop f7. So let's try to see this position. What if the king takes the knight here and the bishop takes bishop? And then we try to trap the black king in the wrong corner, which is a8, because it's the same color as the bishop. But then black can play king a7, attacking that rook. And there's no way we can get our king to c7, which would be a win. So this is a draw. So that doesn't work like that. So white is not ready yet to exchange bishop for knight. So bishop f7 is the knight move. But here black has another resourceful defense. Can you find the defensive move for black here? Yeah. Matt, you're right. Bishop e8. Still the knight d5 trick, and the bishop on f7 is undefended. But now, yeah, bishop e8, exclamation mark. double. Okay, but now we are ready to go into rook versus bishop. So king takes b4, bishop takes f7. And how would you win this with white from now? Now the bishop is on f7 and not e8, as it was before. So that makes a difference. So how to win now with white? Let me see, are we in time to do that? If you play rook f6, let's say, and I move the king somewhere, the bishop somewhere, let's say here, and you play king c5, then I go out. So that's a little bit too slow. But you don't have to get the king to b6. Okay, so here, and then here. Well, there are some of these ideas in the study for sure. But now I'm ready to either get to b7 with my king, and if you try to cut me off, then I will definitely run out of that corner. The white king is too far away. Well, we don't have to get the king to b6. We can also make a mirrored version. We can get the king to c7. So this is actually a little bit of a boring way to solve the solution, to the position. And now we can get c6, c7, and it's winning because the bishop is not on e8, so we can actually go across to c7 now. It's still defending our rook. That was pretty simple, right? And now we just go this way, king a7, king c7. I have a suspicion this puzzle won the first prize, and it might be because of the final idea. I think there was a couple of nice moves where everything was hanging, a lot of tricks, but the intended solution was rook h6. And now black is completely paralyzed, because if you move the king, then we have either rook check on h8 and back to h7, or we can go to h7 directly, then we win the bishop. So the rook cannot move. So we have to make a bishop move to the 8th rank. There is rook h8. We cannot go here on h5, g6. So we cannot go to a2 because of rook a6. So the only move is bishop d5. But now white win the tempo to get to b6, say. And we trap the king in the corner. So that's a nice idea to play rook h6. What if after bishop e8, white plays another move, like retreat the bishop to c4? I suspect you mean earlier. So let's get back to that. But there was a very simple solution, just getting the king to c7 instead of rook h6. Let's try to go back. So let's see. So what if after bishop e8? Oh, okay. A simple solution like moving the bishop back to c4. I understand what you're saying. But then I can play, I believe, knight c6. And then if you try to pin my knight, then I can attack the rook. So it seems to be the only way. After bishop c4, we are only attacking the knight. So black is able to solve that problem. Okay. So a nice study with some of these fortress ideas. This one is, yeah, so this knight is trapped on b7. And if white loses that knight, then definitely rook and pawn versus knight is a win. So we need to come up with something special. If we move that knight, or we can try to save both knights. So, so the first move is knight e3. And now black has a choice. Let's say rook d3. Yeah, if rook e5, then we are able to play knight c4, and then the knight can just defend each other. That's fine. So black plays rook d3 and now attacking both knights. And here's the brilliant point of this study. King c2, take the knight. And where do we move the white knight now? We move it to d8. So attacking that pawn. So now the black rook has to stay on these 5 squares. So the problem is that if the king moves to, let's say, here or here, then we cannot go to this square because of the knight 4. Then we only have 4 squares. That means that the white king can keep attacking that rook. So if black keeps the pawn here, it's of course a win. But then if white wins the pawn and we go into rook versus knight, it's a draw. So let's see if black can do something tricky. And now we just attack the knight. Rook e4. And now king d3. Rook e5. Now we have to look out for rook d5 check. And now we play king to c3. The moment black puts the rook on e5, we simply wait with king c3. And because we attack that pawn with the knight, the rook is not able to leave the e file. And because we made the waiting move with the king on e5, with the rook on e5, then the black king is not able to move either. So this is kind of a stalemate position. Black cannot improve here. It's going to be a draw. Nope. So black can never sacrifice the pawn and win rook versus knight. Nope, that's rook versus knight is a draw. So what we learned from the fortresses we looked at earlier was that the only problematic case is if the knight was in the corner. Otherwise, in other positions, we looked at this fortress where the knight was just one step away from the corner and then it was a draw. So in most cases, the only thing white needs to do is to keep these two pieces together. It could be a problem if they are far apart. So then the rook side might be able to isolate and track down that knight. But in normal circumstances, an exchange of rook for knight is a draw. But in this case here, there's no real way to, I mean, the white king and knight will find together. There's no way to suggest that black is about to dominate the knight and win it. So this is a draw. Nothing black can do. Let's see here. We just keep attacking that rook. Once it goes to e5, we go to c3. So, and if rook c5 check, we can go to b4. Not d4 because of rook d5 pick up the knight. But here, the knight is also controlling c6. It's a nice point. So rook has to go back here, and then we go back to c3. So that was a nice stalemate position. Okay, I have, okay, we can take this, which is another good example of when white chooses the moment to enter a rook versus knight endgame, it has to be the right circumstances. So if white, for instance, chooses to play rook takes e1 here, and black takes the knight, and then we try to somehow trap that knight, it looks like it's in a bad way, this knight. But because we have the pawn, that black knight is actually able to escape the corner and get to the black king. Then if we can connect these king and knight, then black will make a draw. And that is going to happen in this position. Something like this. And then we can play here and then knight c4 next. And this is a draw. So black is fine here, getting the knight out. So white has to be more clever. So the bishop on e1 is hanging, but so is the knight on b3. So here's the point of the study. We are going to move this knight around in a funny way. So it gets all the way up to h8. And then we force black to take that knight in the corner square, because then we can pin the knight here on the h file. So here's how it goes. Knight d4 check. And then knight b5 check. Because if black tries to go here, we always have check that defends the knight. And we can pick up the bishop afterwards. So black has to continue up. We give a check here. And again, if the black king goes off the c file, then we can check and defend the knight, and king takes bishop. So black has to go up still, has to stay there. And now we have to stay on the 7th rank, because if we go to the 6th rank, then check and pick up the bishop. And then check, check. And now the knight is trapped in the corner. But now we are ready to take that bishop. And black has to go g3 now. But now the knight is not coming out. And we can approach that pawn. So now we end up in a typical, so black is unpinning that knight and moves the pawn forward. Black is trying to get that knight out. So, but this is a case where the king and knight is apart, and the knight is going to drop. But it only worked because we forced the black king all the way up to h8, which is a very nice point. So the whole point of the study is that if we win material from the beginning, we don't have the right circumstances where rook versus knight win, because in most cases it's a fortress. There's no win. So we have to create those circumstances based on the fortress. And this is what white just did. So that's the solution of the study. So here's another one. It's a famous one with an H pawn. Say famous one from Sam Lloyd. Does anyone know the answer here? I think I will let you see that when I send the base out, because I still want to get to show the two other fortress positions before we come to the end of the presentation. So the idea is to try to sacrifice the bishop in the corner. Yep, that's correct, but we have to do it the right way. So when I send the chess base out, the database out, you will see this in there and the solution. And until then, you can try to solve it maybe. Okay, so let's move on. So there are many reasons why I like this study, but there is actually a fortress involved deep into this study. So let's start out. It's a little bit confusing when we start out with the puzzle. So 3 pieces each, and white has this extra pawn on d7. So let's see. The first move is queen g5. And this is a very strong move because we're trying to dominate the black king. So if, for instance, black eliminates that pawn, we have knight f4, and then suddenly we control all the squares around the black king, and bishop h5 is going to be a devastating move. So nice coordination there between queen, knight, and bishop. So the best black can do here is run with the king, and that is a discovered check to the white king. And now king to g1 is a brilliant move. And the reason why we have to go to g1 is that there are no queen checks later. You will see that. That's why queen e1 doesn't work, because there's a check on b4 later. So let's just accept that for now. King g1. King. And now knight to c5. So this is a very nice idea. King c8 is the main line. And afterwards, we are going to look at this sideline, because there is a fortress involved there. So let's just look at the main line, king c8. If the king goes here, we have a knight fork. So king c8. We can check on a6. Now check on g3. Does anyone see the win here for white? Yeah, it is a version of the smothered mate. It's very nice. And this is a moment where knight d7, and there is no check on b4. That's why the king had to go to g1 from the beginning. So now we're threatening both knight, queen b8 checkmate, and knight b6. So you could try to defend with queen d8. And I don't think you will see a more beautiful smothered mate than this one. So that's a very nice point to the study. So another thing we need to know is, so black cannot even sacrifice the knight, the queen for knight. But if we remove these two pieces, it's usually a win for the queen side, unless black can get a very specific setup. So queen versus bishop and knight, there is one fortress position there, as far as I know. And that's what I'm going to show. If instead of king c8, the main line, black had played king to d6, then we get into this main line. Queen g3 is clever, because if king takes here, we have queen a3, winning the queen. So the knight on c5 is poisoned. And then black can play king d5. Then we have bishop c4 check. Same ideas. The knight takes the knight, then we win the queen. And if the king moves to d4, then we have knight e6. So king has to take the bishop. Then we have queen b3 check. Take the knight, or king to d4, knight e6. In both cases, black loses the knight, the queen. So, okay. So if black can make this setup where the bishop goes back to b7 and the knight is transferred to d5, then you can see that all these squares would be covered. And we would make a fortress like this with the bishop on b7, and the king can just move around in a triangle in the corner. That would be a fortress. So the black knight is now aiming for d5, and the black bishop is aiming back to b7. But it turns out that black is one move short of achieving this. So let's see. First, we try to get the knight to d5. But white is just in time to break through here. Check and king to d4. And now bishop b7. If black had one move here, black would play king back to a7. And then because black has these three moves with the king, or can play the bishop back and forth here, there's no way to put black in Zugzwang. We don't have to move that knight on d5. But unfortunately for black, it is white to move. And white can play queen c5. Yeah, queen b8 might be an option too. Oh, that's down to details. As I remember it, it was queen c5 that was the only move. But when I see it now, it makes total sense to play queen b8. Let's say while you're doing the puzzles in a short while, I will check up on queen b8 here. But queen c5 is a nice point because now the black king was not able to get back to a7 for the fortress. And now something like this. And because the king is not in the corner now, white can put black in Tukdrop. So this is winning for white. Black doesn't have any good move here without losing material. So let me check queen b8 to stop king a7. Let me check that when you do the puzzles. Okay, so very nice sideline that where black was one move away from building that fortress with queen versus bishop and knight. So this one is white to move and draw. And this is one of those where white can be, or black can be up a queen, but it's a positional draw. So white is not able to stop that f pawn from promoting. But instead we can, white has some clever ideas here. So if white tries to be clever, there's some ideas with perpetual, something like this. But if you try to be clever with bishop c5 first, then knight f7, knight a6 is not possible because the queen can take the knight. So that doesn't work. So what we do is we first play knight f7, check, we switch the move order, and then play bishop c5. Now black has to promote, otherwise we take the pawn. And in this position, what is the way to a draw for white here? White to move and draw. It's a very beautiful positional draw, this one. So let's see. The pawn is unprotected, but not really hanging because of knight f7 check. So if the black knight moves, we need to have a bishop check that forces the knight back to g7. And then if the knight is pinned, black cannot move any of those things. So bishop a3. Let's just see the solution first. Bishop a3, I suspect there is a problem. Black can give the right checks and then maybe the king and bishop will be in each other's way over here, so you cannot play bishop b2, which you intend to do. So, but the right move is bishop d6. Because it turns on either of these two squares, the bishop is safe because we have knight f7 check. So in this position, we simply get the bishop to e5 and we have a draw. So after bishop d6, there's nothing black can do. If the knight moves, then we check, and then we just stay on e5 with the bishop. So let's quickly see bishop a3. So I have a suspicion that maybe something like queen c4. Now we cannot play king b2 because that blocks the bishop. So maybe king a1 or king b1. But now if nothing else, let's say, it doesn't really matter here. Now I can get my knight to d4, I believe. Something like this. So that should be enough for the win. So you're trying to get into that long diagonal, but we have to do it from D6. Okay, very nice idea. So that was what I wanted to present you before letting you go off with the puzzles. You will recognize a lot of the stuff getting to the puzzles. So I will see you again in half an hour. Okay, so long.